This is our second video explaining some of the works that we cover in Unit number 4. We had just talked about John Donne's two poems, A Valediction Forbidding Mourning and Death Be Not Proud. At the end of those, in our textbook, there's an exercise that the class did on page 431. I want to go over that with you first. Comprehension check on A Valediction Forbidding Mourning. What disagreement does the first stanza of A Valediction Forbidding Mourning describe? In the first stanza, the speaker suggests that the lovers should part peacefully, just like righteous men who peacefully pass away. So he says, as virtuous men pass mildly away, and whisper to their souls to go, while some of their sad friends do say, the breath goes now, and some say no, so let us melt and make no noise. So just as peaceful people go into death quietly, he says, let me go on my voyage quietly. Let's not have all these tears and all this fussing, and just let me part peacefully, please. Number 2, according to the speaker, how should he and his beloved part? They should part quietly and without making a fuss. Number 3, according to the speaker, why do the lovers' souls endure an expansion rather than a breach? Well, a breach would be a break in their relationship, and he doesn't want that at all. That isn't what the speaker suggests. Instead, the speaker suggests the lovers will never truly be apart and will always remain connected. In Holy Sonnet number 10, what does the speaker tell Death in the first 2 lines of the poem? He tells Death not to be proud, because Death is not mighty or powerful as some people think. According to the speaker, what are Death's pictures? In other words, what are Death's images? He said, rest and sleep. We aren't afraid of rest and sleep. We invite rest and sleep. And so death, when it does come, should be as inviting as rest and sleep are. According to the speaker, to what is death a slave? Death is a slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. Now, in this first part of our unit, we also have Jonathan Swift's introduction and a long selection of Gulliver's Travels. Virtual students need to read those selections. I will make a separate video a little bit later on that goes and explains those. But in class, we skipped that and went on to our Cavalier and Carpe Diem themed poetry. So in your textbook, go to page 472. This is our small group learning section, although with the age of coronavirus, we're having to do this together in class. But you do have your intro to Andrew Marvell, a little paragraph there on page 472, and then we have our first poem, To His Coinmistress. Now, Andrew Marvell had friends who were Puritans, because he was a Puritan himself, and Cavaliers, those who supported King Charles against Parliament. So he fared pretty well. Whoever was in charge, he had friends who knew him, and so he did not get in trouble the way many Puritans did. But he had so many Cavalier friends that a lot of his poetry reads more like Carpe Diem, seize the day, live for today, don't worry about tomorrow, rather than deeply religious poetry that most of the Puritans would write. To His Coinmistress is a lengthy poem. You are to read this poem, and you notice it's in 3 stanzas. It's in our textbook on page 473, 474, and 475. In the first stanza we have, and he sets them up almost like verse paragraphs rather than stanzas, but we can still call them stanzas because it's poetry. Had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness lady were no crime. And he goes into great detail, trying to explain to her that if they had all the time in the universe, he could spend years and years praising every part of her. But then we get to the second stanza. But, he says, at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. So we as human beings don't have all the time in the world. And so he's encouraging her not to brush him off, not to play bashful and coy and shy, but to accept his love since they are mortal and they don't have all the time in the world. And then he comes to a conclusion in that last stanza, now therefore, while the youthful hue sits on my skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may. And so, seize the day, live for today, carpe diem philosophy. Since we don't have all the time in the world, he's telling her not to refuse love when love is offered to her. We have an exercise at the end on page 476 that the class has gone over. And so let's take a look at that. What adjective does the speaker use to describe the behavior and attitude of his mistress? Well, he says she is coy or modest, but tends to be flirtatious too. But she's holding back when she should take advantage of his love. Under what circumstances would the speaker be willing to accept his mistress's reluctance? He says he would wait for her if there were all the time in the world, but there's not. 3. What does the speaker always hear at his back? He says he always hears time's winged chariot hurrying near. We have a similar expression today. We say time flies. What course of action does the speaker propose in the final stanza? The speaker presses his mistress to take his proposal seriously before their youth is gone. Now, in addition to Marvel's Carpe Diem poetry, our book includes a few other selections as well. Turn to page 481 in your textbook. Here we have the introductions to Robert Herrick and John Gay. Read those, please. And then we have a very famous Carpe Diem poem, maybe the ultimate Carpe Diem poem, To the Virgins to Make Much of Time by Robert Herrick. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying, and the same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, the higher he's a-getting, the sooner will his race be run, and nearer he's to setting. That age is best which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer, but being spent, the worst and worst times still succeed the former. Then be not coy, but use your time, and while you may go merry, for having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. So along the very same lines of Andrew Marvell's poem, To His Coy Mistress, we have this very famous poem, To the Virgins to Make Much of Time. Virgin was a word used in the Elizabethan age and immediately after for a young unmarried woman. And so here, youth is being encouraged not to wait for love, but to take love when one is young, because one will get old and then maybe nobody will want them anymore. And so this is obviously a seize the day moment. Now, why do these people write like that? You know, why is that their subject? You remember, this is during the English Civil War. Things were scary. From one week to the next, you didn't know whether the Puritans are going to be in control, whether the Royalists would be in control. One week he might be put in jail, the next week he might be let out, the next week he might be put in jail again, and the next week he might get executed. So you had no idea what was coming up. And therefore, during wartime, people are often pressed to find love. People are often pressed to go ahead and get married. We all know the stories of World War I and World War II, wartime marriages, where somebody would meet somebody, get engaged the next week, get married, and then the sailor would ship off. And the girl left behind never knew whether her new husband would be back or not. Much the same thing going on right here. And so that's why that time element is so important to them, to make much of the time that they have. The next poem that we have in that unit is very close to it as well, and that is a poem by John Gay, Youth's the Season Made for Joys. Youth's the season made for joys, love is then our duty. She alone who that employs well deserves her beauty. Let's be gay while we may, beauty's a flower despised in decay. Let us drink and sport today, ours is not tomorrow. Love with youth flies swift away, age is naught but sorrow. Dance and sing, time's on the wing, life never knows the return of spring. Sounds very much like a song, doesn't it? Let's take a look at our comprehension check at the end of those poems on page 484. To the Virgins to Make Much of Time. Number 1, what advice does the speaker give women in the first stanza? The speaker advises women to enjoy rosebuds, the joys of youth, because days are short. According to the speaker, which stage of life is the best? He says youth is the best stage of life. You've heard some people say maybe these are the best days of your life. Well, it's the same kind of idea. Well, I hope these are not the best days of your life. Things get wonderful later on too. But hang in there. Okay. But yes, it is a wonderful time to be young. 3. What warning does the speaker give to women? The poem suggests that time passes quickly. The speaker encourages the virgins to marry while they can, because if they wait too long, they might not have the chance. And then the second part, youth's the season made for joys. According to the speaker, what is our duty when we are young? Love is our duty when we are young. Because when you're young, you have your beauty, you have your good looks. Number 2, how does the speaker feel about growing old? He says growing old is sorrowful. And so enjoy your youth while you have it. And then 3, according to the speaker, what happens to love when youth is gone? He says it simply flies swift away. So that theme of grabbing love, grabbing enjoyment, grabbing life while you can, that's the Carpe Diem philosophy. Seize the day, because you never know what tomorrow will bring. Now, in our third poetry collection that we have a long section from Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy. We're going to skip that in our unit, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to take a look at a modernist poem by William Butler Yates. So let me scroll through the Divine Comedy section and get to Mr. Yates. There we go. And this is called The Second Coming. Now, William Butler Yates had a very strange philosophy. He believed that every 2,000 years, good and evil changed sides. For the last 2,000 years, the Christian era, we had relatively a good time where we admired qualities like peace and love and justice. But the next 2,000 years, who knows what's going to happen? Well, why did he feel that way? Well, he knew the World War period was coming. People were talking about war. This is written early in the 20th century. And so after people lived through World War I and some lived through World War II, they thought the world might be coming to an end. Everything was just horrible. All of what they had known, all their normality was gone. And so in the second coming, he warns about what might happen. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dim tide is loosed. And everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? So there in the last part of this highly imaginative poem, he thinks about baby Jesus being born 2,000 years ago and how that has framed 2,000 years of human history. So for the next power to come, which he believes was an evil power to grow, he pictures the Sphinx in Egypt coming to life and representing a beast that's going to be pouncing on the world. And I suppose somebody who was a deep thinker and thought about that coming World War I and World War II era, thought they were living in a time of great horror. At the beginning of the poem, he describes the falcon image, about how you train a falcon to go in a circle as it's hunting. You keep him on a lanyard on a long, long rope with his eyes covered. But if the falcon gets away from that gyre, that circle that he's been trained to hunt in, he's gone. You can't control him anymore. The blood-dim tide is loosed, he says, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Now, what's the warning he gives us? Look at these lines right here. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. In other words, bad people, they're energetic. They work all the time. But he's afraid that modern man is apathetic and is not doing anything. So unless we do something to change present circumstances, to make things better, bad people are going to keep on ruling. Bad people are going to keep on doing what they're doing. So it's up to us to make a change. So that's what he's really hopeful for in this poem. We'll continue our discussion in number 3.